competition cannot be managed. Like there were like for example, in the Cold War, right? We had a lot of management of a competition from Seoul to whatever. So do you see that there's some sort of barrier that this time there cannot be any management of this competition? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you raised the Cold War because actually, as we look back upon it, even though I lived through it and I remember it was very stark, we did actually manage it reasonably well. We had Helsinki Accords, we had START treaties, we got rid of smallpox. You know, Khrushchev even came to the United States. When was it? 1953?
Right.
Went across the country. I think it was then he banged his shoe on the table at the UN and said, "We'll bury you." But never mind, we did have interaction and we had systems set up for instance, exchange of journalists, which is sort of collapsed in China. There is something about Xi Jinping's version of us and them, of China as being maligned, and that makes it even more difficult than it was to deal with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. There's something so deep in his soul, I think, about this idea of great power predation. And he has wedded himself so deeply to China's system, just as many leaders in Russia did to the Soviet system, Marxism, Leninism. But do remember that Russia had Khrushchev.
Right.
And Khrushchev was like Hu Yaobang or Zhao Ziyang or Deng Xiaoping, not Xi Jinping. He's like I hate to say it, he's a bit like Stalin. And that's a difficult one to choke down. And particularly if you view it as in certain measure a kind of a psychological problem, how do you respect Stalin? You know, it's all good on the gulags, you know, Yosef, no problem. Let's just get the oil pipes pumping and let's just trade, and, you know, let's not worry our little heads about the rest of it.
I guess
don't think that's gonna work.
Like strength, right? It's probably like building internal strength because that is respected. So it's like hard power.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, there's an expression in Chinese that came down, well, it really sort of gathered momentum in the late Qing dynasty. It's fuqiang, wealth and power. What China was after, whether it was the Qing dynasty, Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, it was rejuvenation. Another word that's huge in Chinese is fuxing, rejuvenation. And it means China is not just seeking to be accepted and become soluble in the outside world. It means it wants to be the wealthiest and the most powerful and to be able to throw its weight around. So that's a pretty toxic aspiration if you're trying to fit into an existing rules-based order, as the US hoped China would in its vision of engagement.
I mean, obviously, this sounds all pretty much incompatible then to any sort of kind of management. So when you think about the outlook for, you know, let's say the next 6 to 12 months, are there any kind of interesting, you know, events or things to watch where you would say, okay, here we could see some changes, here we like some sort of improvement, some sort of management, or even risks?
Well, listen, I think we're in a rather dire situation. If I was Biden, who I generally support and think he's done a very good job, I think his people understand the challenge. They're responding, but they do try to keep the door open. They do try to watch their language and look for opportunities. If I was Biden, I would call up Xi Jinping and I'd say, listen, buddy, we're at a crisis here. We're heading towards the abyss. I am sending over one or two of my, not people in the government, trusted people and I want you to appoint two similar people. I mean, I would be thinking of people like President Clinton or Barack Obama or even Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State, or someone of high standing. Kissinger's a bit old, and also he's drunk a bit of too much of the Chinese Kool-Aid at this point. And let's send them to Switzerland. Let's send them to Singapore. You send two of your most trusted people, sit them down and see if we can't come up with some other way of deporting ourselves, and get two ideas that they think will be possibly acceptable to you and I, and then let's talk about it. Now, short of that, I don't think these summits, these side meetings at G7, G20, whatever, are going to accomplish much. And we saw what happened to Blinken's trip when the balloon sailed over. We're at a moment where something dramatic has to happen, and I deeply believe in diplomacy. And I think Biden is capable of that. I'm not so sure about Xi Jinping, because I think in Xi's syndrome, diplomacy, which involves making concessions on both sides, appears as weakness. And if there's one thing Xi cannot afford to do, and here he's very much like Putin, is evince any indication of anything that might look like weakness.
So would you recommend Xi Jinping the same as Biden? Or
yes. Yeah. I mean, I think if Xi Jinping were smart, he wouldn't wait for Biden to do it. He'd do it himself. And then China, which is trying to take global leadership in a certain way, as we saw that in the rapprochement between the Saudis, Iranians, and that China helped bring about, and his so-called peace plan for the Ukraine, which is pretty not going to be acceptable. But if he really wanted to be a global leader, which I think he does, this would be a hell of a good move for him. But he'd have to make it in a way that was genuine, and not the way he's ponied up this nonsensical, peace initiative with the Ukraine, where he's hugging it out with Putin at the same time that he's saying he's neutral. Nobody believes it. It's preposterous. It's like an extremely badly written play. And I don't know who's advising him to do this, but as I say, if you're looking to be, the king of peace, this is not a very convincing way to go about it.
Do you think the incentives are aligned, that or do you think like China is winning in the current status quo?
I think that we've got to wait and see. In certain ways, we have to remember China still has a lot of cards to play. It's got a very powerful economy. It's strategically, really on the job, tenacious. They don't miss a beat. The problem is, as I look at it, but then I'm less of an economist and more of a historian, is that I don't think they have a very good product to sell. Right. I mean, you walk the streets of New York, go on the subway. I mean, almost everyone is just off the boat from someplace. Immigrants, and they're the heart and soul of this country. They've made it strong. They're the ones building all the buildings, sawing all the trees down when hurricanes hit, out there doing the hard work. They're hungry. Are any of these people trying to get into China? I haven't seen any. So whatever mess America is in, and God knows my country has a way of shooting itself in the foot 10 times a day, it still has an amazing allure and strength and is a magnet. And I think this is the problem. China's product is not basically very appealing to anybody. Their wealth and their power is, but their product, their system, their culture, their body politic, the way of life is not. And I think that's something worth noting.
Would you say that, because it's just interesting because you kind of mentioned, I was just immediately thinking, well, isn't China's nationalism that's quite strong, isn't that like, an advantage to one extent or another as well?
It's interesting, when the Qing dynasty ended in 1911, 12, one of the great critiques of China was it didn't have nationalism. And that was Sun Yat-sen's whole thing, the Nationalist Party. He set it up. We need to bring ourselves together with nationalism, not just culture, to be strong. Chiang Kai-shek did the same thing. So nationalism is relatively new to China, but it's also incredibly dangerous. And you rely on nationalism to bring your country together, and it's like eating a meal all just of potatoes.
Right.
So you ask, is nationalism still seductive in China? Yes, it is, because every Chinese wants to see their country powerful, respected, and successful, because they felt victimized, they felt looked down on. But if you talk to almost anyone in the professional classes, educated people, there's tremendous amount of circumspection about what Xi is doing the COVID vaccine thing, his support of the Ukraine, his love affair with Putin. I mean, this is pretty horrifying to people who maybe are not even westernized, but just civilized people who read books and care about how people treat each other in the world. They look at this and they just shake their heads. And if they can, many of them run for the doors.
Oh, well, before we kind of wrap it up with some, key takeaways, what do you think over the, next, or over this year, let's say, are the key risks to watch? What do you think should people really watch out for?
Well, I'm watching very carefully the Russian-Chinese so-called alliance, and we just saw another few bricks laid in that wall with Xi and Moscow, and Xi is trying to convert Russia into the junior partner, whereas China used to be the junior partner. But I think we should also watch the way in which that axis of Moscow, Budapest, Iran, maybe Turkey, but we may have an election in Turkey and things change. But I think that's where we're headed, and I want to see how that comes together. And on the other hand, I think the greatest deterrent against all of this is for the allies to come together, as I think we are, but also to be very careful, watch our rhetoric, and don't miss a single chance, because it's possible China will change. And maybe the best thing that could happen to China is a big, bad economic downturn, which would make them realize they are dependent on it. They can't just be throwing their weight around and gobbling up Hong Kong and gobbling up Taiwan and sorry, the South China Sea is ours. That we live in a symbiotic world where we do have to give a little and get a little and work things out and concede and be nice to each other, rather than just sort of wolf warrior diplomacy is not a successful way to be in the world if you want peace.
Yes. Do you have because you just mentioned, let's say the axis, it's a little bit of an opportunistic club, I would say, or possibly. Yeah. And for the allies, is there any prediction that you have what might happen over the next 12 months? Anything that we kind of we will possibly see with some sort of probability, where you say, oh, that's likely?
Well, we didn't see Deng Xiaoping coming after Mao's death. So we never know when a leader will die, when a leader will be overturned, when for some reason something will change. We've never predicted any big change that's happened in China, and yet they have happened, and they will continue to happen. And incipient within China, our force is very different from Xi Jinping. I mean, I've lived it for 60 years. I've watched them. I know the people. There are a lot of immensely talented, able, wonderful Chinese who want nothing more than to be in a global world with China rising peacefully, accepted by everyone else. We trade, and maybe our political systems aren't exactly the same, but But China, it seems to me, to really be respected and successful, it needs to move towards a more just, fair, free, and open system. Maybe not like the United States or Germany or Britain, but something that's headed in that direction. Otherwise, we're going to be in an ideological standoff, and it's going to make economic cooperation extremely difficult, more and more difficult. And this is why it's important for companies, I think, to kind of get a sense of which way the wind is blowing, and sort of a plan, get a plan B.
If you would advise a decision maker that, obviously, like our clients, for example, they're forced to make decisions usually, what would you advise them? How would you describe this kind of new area, and what would be the one takeaway from our chat today? What would it be?
To understand what the forces are at work in China today, and to let that determine whether they invest more or less and begin to diversify and decouple. But in any event, the advice I would give them, the world is a parlous, dangerous place, and it's dividing rapidly, and as much as you can, diversify.
On that note, Orville, apart from Cassandra and the Asia Society, where can people follow you?
Well, where can they follow me? I mean, I'm
You're all over.
all the time. I don't indulge in too much self-promotion, but I'm out in the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Orville. It was great.